us to talk about baking in such a snowy day in Montana. And of course, thank you so much, Mark, for offering your valuable time and experience talking to our students, our stakeholders.
My pleasure. Yeah. Maybe I should just unshare the screen for a moment as we get started. Where do I do that? Yeah, stop sharing. Okay. So then they can see me, at least for the introduction.
Great.
All right. Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Mark Florka. I am a baker and a pastry chef by trade. I came to this connection with Dr. Koo vis-a-vis a colleague from ADM that I worked with at ADM Research for many years, and it so happens we're both retired, and he referred to me to Dr. Koo for a project, and we've been enjoying that interaction quite a bit. I've been in the baking industry and the food industry for about 47 years now. And so I retired from ADM 2 years ago, but I've not stopped being in the industry. So I'm still actively doing little projects along the way. As you are having a snowy winter in Montana, you can all be jealous of me sitting in San Francisco at 64-degree weather. So I'm here on a project to work with some people I've connected with, also through a former colleague at ADM and things like that. So I try to bring a wealth of experience to different situations as far as my baking experience, the artisanal experience, combined with what I have absorbed over the years as far as food science understanding and knowledge. I do not have a food science degree, but I'm quite competent and pretty well versed on most of the principles. I spent my first 20 years in hospitality, as I tend to generalize it. I worked and started off as a traditional apprenticeship in a small pastry shop, and from there went through convention centers, restaurant complexes, resorts, large hotels, wholesale bakeries, et cetera, and then landed at ADM as a technical service representative for the flour milling group, and then worked my way up through different opportunities and landed at ADM Research at the North American headquarters in Decatur, where I was the principal bakery scientist for 11 years at ADM. So I spent 25 years in total with ADM. So that's kind of my background. So I have very few slides, so I might just sort of switch back and forth. And I'd like this to be sort of conversational for you all, in that I would like it to just trying to move out of the way. There we go. It doesn't want to display now. That, don't wait for the end of the presentation for, questions and things as they come up. Feel free to jump in with a question. Is there a chat feature that helps us do that, or do we raise hands? How does that work here, Dr. Ko?
Yes, great question. You can either unmute yourself and then interrupt our speaker because you'll find that it's so exciting. I always want to interrupt him because I always have so much
because I ramble too. So
because when you talk to him, you realize that, oh, I have more and more questions I want to ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or you can type in the chat.
And I enjoy the questions, and I always truly hope that we come up with questions that I don't know the answers to, so that it gives me a new challenge to investigate and to research and things.
You never get to retire.
Okay, so why is this not sharing now? Sure, but anyway, so this is about the science of baking and innovation. So we want to sort of focus on the science side of this, and with a focus on the Montana specialty crops and sprouted crops. So wanted to start with talking about, first of all, as you look at the crops you have available in your area, the kind of innovation opportunities it presents. And obviously, one of the very first ones that these days that is top of mind for so many people is plant protein. So when you look at the various types of legumes and other grains, what is the protein value there? In your region, I believe a lot of what is grown besides wheat is also lentils, like things like lentils and beans, navy beans, black beans, etc., as well as some peas and things of that nature. And so there's a lot of protein extraction opportunities with that. The other interesting thing is whole grain nutrition. A lot of legumes will often fall into the grain category. And one of the things that North Americans lack in their diet still is whole grains, sufficient whole grains. You may be aware that the USDA has changed the pyramid a number of times in the last 20 years. And a lot of those times it's been changing and increasing the amount of whole grain that we need more of in our diet to get more fiber and other nutrients, right? Um, with the protein separation, the other thing you create is specialty starches. So now you have these starches that will have different types of properties. You'll have different types of starch damage. You'll have different types of swelling, maybe a lot of slower retrogradation, which can be really good for shelf life. And then the last thing is, so that addresses shelf life in that respect. And then the other thing to consider is a lot of these legumes and types of grains also contain fiber. And so fiber is, of course, part of the whole grain thing. And in general, when we're, as I talk a little bit more further about formulating things, the thing also to keep in mind is that when you stuff people with a lot of protein, you need some fiber there to help ease movement through their body, through the system. Otherwise, you create bowel blockages and stuff with, especially with plant protein. Some people are extremely sensitive to it, as a matter of fact. Um, and so some other things then with innovation challenges is, so you can see the list of challenges is a little bit longer. And that is because a lot of these things are, I would say they're non-traditional. So from a baking perspective, they create new challenges. And so this is where we use science and research to understand what kind of challenges is this ingredient going to represent, and how are we going to address those? So some of the things are going to be functionality. So if you're using a pea protein to increase protein in a cookie or something like that, you're going to be diluting the functionality of the wheat gluten that is inherently there. So how are you going to balance that to get the right texture and flow in the oven and all these types of things, right? So you want to look at that. Within the functionality, one of the key things with a lot of the legume type products in particular, when they are, I know, for example, ADM, what they do is they cook the beans and then they dehydrate them and then they grind them into a powder. And so this powder is, for one, it has a very fine particle size, and inherently the beans, because they're so high in protein, they absorb so much moisture. So you're drawing more moisture into the product. Can you evaporate that in the cooking process, or is it going to increase your water activity in terms of shelf life issues or things like that? So that speaks then to the moisture retention. So do you want to retain moisture or do you not want to retain it? Some of these types of proteins will make the product, a baked good in particular, very wet and gummy. And they like to hold on to the water. It's not easy to get it to evaporate or dry out. And so extremely long baking cycles are not desirable. Not so much from the simple things like you think, like maybe burning or something. You can always lower the temperature, but it's the cost of energy. So that if you're baking now something for an hour, where a traditional product is baked for 20 minutes, you have to factor that energy cost into the product as well. So does it now put that out of range of being attractive enough to sell? Right? And so water activity is then the other thing. A lot of times the bean powders or similar legume powders will retain that moisture, won't bake out easily, but it's fully free to ferment and to, give you other bacterial issues. So can you use sugars or other humectants in combination with that to keep your water activity down? Of course, one of the things we have a lot, I am a resource at Bakerpedia. I'm the podcast host for the Baked in Science podcast, and I host some of the seminars and do some occasional video blogs as well and things on baking. And everything from Bakerpedia, for the most part, is free, other than the certification programs. Right? So you're welcome to look that up anytime as well, too. So going back to the water activity, one of the questions we get a lot of on Bakerpedia is about shelf life and mold. One of the things to keep in mind that once you have baked a product, you have reached an internal temperature of 180 degrees Fahrenheit at least. In a lot of cases, it's a little bit higher than that. So you've pretty much, as your baked product comes out of the oven, you have destroyed all of the bacteria and pathogens that could possibly be in any way harmful. So the problem with water activity and mold growth, for example, is contamination. So if you notice if you've ever bought a loaf of bread and forgot about it on the kitchen counter, heaven forbid, and you'll notice that the mold is on the outside of the bread. It doesn't really happen on the inside of the slices unless you have touched them. And so that just simply a touch is the contamination. So the reason there may be mold on the outside of the bread is because of contamination during packaging, whether someone touched it without a glove, with a dirty glove, or mechanics that touched it that aren't sanitary. And it's always almost always a transfer situation, but it could also be just atmosphere. Sometimes people are especially like in the Middle East and stuff where things are very challenging with climate and so on, is they'll have great big fans blowing to try and cool the product. But the thing is, they're blowing all the dirty air in from where the cars are driving past in the street, the muddy street that doesn't have any pavement. And so you're getting all kinds of contamination that way. So that is why the water activity is still important, is to be able to manage the possibility, in other words, to limit mold growth and or other bacteria growth. And so that is, as we've discussed already, that's a big part of shelf life. But the other thing with shelf life, as I mentioned previously, is looking at your starches and how these starches are interacting, so that you want to reduce staling as much as possible. And staling is the starch retrogradation process, where the starch molecules start to recrystallize, and this gives you this staling feature, and it makes the breads, for example, very firm. They go from soft to firm over time as the starch retrogrades. The other thing is then ingredient labeling. How is this ingredient to be labeled? With plant proteins, that tends to not be as much of a problem most of the time. With some of the more novel proteins and things like that, that are, for example, there's proteins that are produced from fermentation of algae and then extracted. So is algal protein something that's going to be desirable on the label? Are there alternative names that you could use for it that are legally acceptable and then more acceptable to the consumer? So you need to keep those things in mind. The other things in terms of how your protein might be processed, if there are special definitions that you must use, again, are they going to be acceptable to the target audience that you're looking at? So the world of clean label is what we're talking about there. Clean label is not legally defined by FDA or USDA. It is a consumer preference. But it is driven by large supermarket chains and things like Kroger and Whole Foods. They all have their own, what the researchers will refer to as a no-no list. Some of them contain things simply because of how they sound. The general rule of thumb is pantry recognizable ingredients. And so for example, one example I like to use is that one of the ingredients that is often removed from the acceptability list is xanthan gum, and simply because it starts with the letter X. It is a natural product that is produced through fermentation, but the type of enzyme that is used in the process, which is xylose, that is why the researchers way back when gave it that name, xanthan gum. And so a lot of the larger chains have decided that it doesn't fit for clean label, right? Even though many consumers recognize it as being natural, right? Then, of course, there's sensory perception. So some of the cleanest proteins, when we're talking about protein, some of the cleanest proteins tend to be whey and egg albumin from egg whites. Soy is very close behind in that. It's very popular. And so some of the things that are growing in popularity are things like pea, beans, and lentils, especially the legume type products. Peanuts have long been very popular because peanut flavor is not objectionable at all. People enjoy it as long as you don't have a peanut allergy. That is fine. But the thing about pea is that it tends to have a very strong note at times, right? It tastes very pea-like. The other things can be things with beans. They vary. People are, accustomed to flavor profiles from a lot of Latin American cuisine with pinto beans as far as refried beans goes and things like that. So it may be something that fits in okay. But when you go to black beans or red beans, like the kidney beans, those flavors are a little bit more unique. The white navy bean, although it's called navy bean, it's actually a pale white creamy color, is probably one of the most popular for use as a whole grain or a protein source or fiber source and so on, because it is quite neutral in flavor. It's a very pleasant flavor, right? And all of these also have the ideal opportunity of being used in gluten-free is something to keep in mind. So that what I always like to point out was that you're getting a really nice flavor compared to the blandness of just plain starches like rice and cornstarch and potato starch that are used a lot. And you're also getting a much better flavor profile overall. Oops, sorry. I wanted to get that other thing, that notification out of the way. And so you get a better flavor profile from the navy beans, and the texture is also really quite nice. It's great to work with. And most importantly, compared to using just plain starches, is you're getting a more nutrient dense ingredient that you're able to use. And that, leads into the nutrition profile, so that if you're replacing something like cornstarch or rice starch or potato starch in a gluten-free or similar type of formula, you have the opportunity of adding far more nutrition. You're adding fiber and vitamins and minerals that are not present with these other native starches. Health and nutrition claims becomes complicated. There are opportunities, but there's also challenges. One of the things I've just been with a number of people, been having some discussions, and it seems, casually our discussions amongst ourselves are that we get the impression that FDA is not too concerned about enforcing some of their regulations when it comes to the nutrition claims on packaging. And I say this because, but the other part of this is that most of the time, FDA doesn't actually go out and look at packaging and say, no, 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 you can't use that. They will respond based on complaints. And a lot of times complaints happen in the form of a competitor feeling that they're at a disadvantage, and so they will launch a complaint, or a consumer group that feels that they're being duped. And so where I'm leading with this is principally what I'm thinking of is protein. Whole grain is pretty straightforward. It has to be the entire grain, and then it's whole grain. So with a lot of beans and things, that's not an issue. With protein, it gets a little more complicated. There are two methodologies that are looked at in North America, or in the US. We tend to use primarily PDCAS, which is what the FDA refers to, and that's the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score, so PDCAAS. And so what that means is how much of this protein is bioavailable to the body. And so some of the comparisons I can give you are, for example, wheat gluten, which sometimes is used to bolster protein in certain baked goods, is very low in PDCAS. It has a PDCAS of 0.4, which means, for example, if you have 10 grams of wheat protein in your serving size, in terms of a health claim, there is only 4 grams of wheat protein bioavailable to the body to digest because of the amino acid profile. And that's where it gets complicated, right? So this is going to be a little bit of a longer one. And do jump in if you have any questions at all. Please do jump in. And so the one that is held to the sort of the one standard primarily is egg albumin. That is a PDCAS of 1.0. So you can fully digest the protein in egg albumin. Not the liquid egg, the actual protein that's in the egg. So a liquid egg white is approximately 7/8 water and 1/8 protein. So whey is the next highest one. Whey is at about 0.85, and soy is at 0.8. So that is why these are often seen in a lot of protein bars and things like that. Egg albumin is the most expensive, so that tends to be avoided, other than some gluten-free baking where it helps provide some gluten-like functionality for things that are going to be more bread-like in texture, right? And so all this PDCAS stuff, so what do we mean? So it's based on a regulation within the FDA, and strangely enough, it's based on baby food, but essentially they're saying that if you want to put on the front of your package that you have 10 grams of protein, that 10 grams of protein must meet the PDCAS rule for the recommended amount customarily consumed. In product development, we often refer to it as the RAC. Now, recommended amount customarily consumed is not the serving size. This is another one of those confusing points. So the serving size is the size of the serving that you have in your item. So for example, a donut, if you make a yeast donut, that yeast donut is a single serving. Now, if the rack is 50 grams for a yeast donut, then your claim would be based on the 50-gram size of the donut. But if you make gigantic donuts that are 80 grams, you can't use the 80-gram protein content as a health claim, you have to base it on a calculation of a 50-gram recommended amount customarily concerned. So I hope everybody is still with me on that. So if it's a slice of bread, and a slice of bread, the recommended amount, the rack, is 28 grams. But a lot of breads, a lot of these functional, healthy, nutritious breads, the serving size, the size of the slice is anywhere from 40 to 60 grams, because some of them are really dense too, right? And so you might have easily 20 grams of protein in a 60-gram slice of bread, but that doesn't give you a 20-gram protein claim on the front of pack. Even if you said 20 grams per serving, you're not allowed to make that claim unless you meet the rack as well, right, in terms of protein claims. And that is also for the daily value as far as the recommended intake of protein, which is 50 grams on a 2,000 calorie diet, for example. So the other piece of the protein issue that I hinted at as being confusing as well, where not much research has been done at this point to look at it closely. But when we use multiple proteins in a product, so let's say you're making a protein nutrition bar and you have wheat flour in it and you're adding beans to it and you're adding a little bit of soy flour to it as well. You would normally, today, what we do is we just take those protein amounts, that percent of protein in each of those ingredients, and add them all up and calculate and say we have this much protein. You could still apply the PD-Cas values to each one, say, okay, 0.4 on the wheat, 0.8 here, 0.9 there, whatever, add them all up and see how much you have. What is missing within that is that what researchers are now thinking to take a look at is that what is the complementary interaction of the different amino acid profiles with each other. So in other words, it doesn't just simply become, if you take 10 grams of albumin at 1 and 10 grams of wheat flour at 0.4 and combine them together, that you have 0.7. It may be much higher than that, because some of the amino acids in the albumin may be complementary and filling the gaps for the digestibility within the gluten protein that then increase that digestibility overall. So that is something that is being looked at by researchers. And I did hint that there are two, not just one. The other one besides PD-Cas is called the DIAS, and that is the digestibility index amino acid score, and that is used in Europe a lot, right? And so a lot of these are done in test tubes, but they are also done using swine, where the protein is fed to the pig, and then it is removed from the intestine at certain points to see how much of it has been digested before they excrete their feces. Right? So there's a lot of interesting things still going on in some of these innovation challenges and so on. And so then wanted to, oops. There we are. And so now talking about baking science and with all of this, there are, basic two general approaches that need to be, in my view, it's ideal to dovetail these a bit so that you get better information and you proceed much quicker. Right? So bench trials is a process of elimination. So some people go about it in that not using any scientific information and just let's try this, let's try that, let's try this, and 40, 50, 60 trials later, maybe they stumble on something, right? But through elimination, we can sometimes also make some discoveries. Right? Then there's the further development. As you discover something that works well, you develop that out, and then you need to validate so that what works on the bench, will it work on the production line. So dovetailing things in is the characterization of your ingredients. So before you start just randomly doing an elimination process, have the ingredients properly characterized, that especially the specialty ones that you're using to achieve certain goals, and understand what is going to happen with those, so that if you're there's so much different instrumentation and things available on things, so that you might want to take, for example, if it's something sort of more starch related, and take your lentil powders and run them on an RVA, rapid viscoanalyzer. So you can learn a lot about the viscosity in the cooking process, as far as how much water how well it thickens and so on. And you'll also learn, as the RVA cools it down, how quickly it retrogrades. So it gives you a lot of information, and you can extrapolate any enzyme activity from that as well, right? Then the research side of it is sometimes just trying out completely different things that we haven't thought of before. Maybe understanding better the dough rheology on a rheometer, or things like that, or using texture analysis and stuff, and collecting all of this data, and disseminating it and understanding it, so that you can do that further development based on good sound information, right? And I always enjoy quantification, so I love using instruments like texture analyzers, to be able to understand, not just with my fingers is how soft is it, but to actually be able to get a comparative value on different things. And so with that, also understanding that quantification helps with the validation, as does the data collection, and this helps you set up all of your goals and your targets, and understand which ones are movable and which ones are really hard and fast and can't be changed in the process as you scale up and apply the different sciences to things. There's so much that you can analyze for and check for. I'm happy to answer any questions at all, rather than just rambling on things that come to mind. Right? Might be better if you have questions on how things are applied, or what is of most interest to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Do we have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or type your questions in the chat box. And students of the food processing, if you are in our food processing class, once you ask one question, that's one bonus point. Just a reminder.
Bribery.
Bribery. Someone asked a question, I heard.
Yeah, I just had a clarification question, please. Going back to the 50 grams on a 2,000 calorie diet, is that the 50 grams after you apply the PD cast or before?
Correct, after. So if you, let's say if you were trying to get the full 50 grams in a product, you're unlikely, but if you were doing that just for this hypothetical example, and you had ingredients that were your protein totaled up to, let's say 80 grams, you would have to apply the PD cast to that, which would then bring it down to the 50 grams, for example. Okay, so if you had 50 grams of wheat gluten in your product, and you apply the 0.4 PD cast, so in reality, you only have 20 grams of digestible protein. Does that make that a little bit clear?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool.
Oh, and then one more follow-up question to that. Are there any standards be considered high protein, or high protein diet, or high protein food?
The FDA, well, the labeling is set up as a good source of protein. I always forget the middle one, right? There's good source, something. Sorry.
Something like rich.
Yeah, like a rich source of protein and then excellent source of protein. So there's three standards that are left. The idea of high protein is frowned upon in labeling. But because it's what does it mean? There is no regulation for it. Um, like in the wheat flour industry, people will refer to a high protein flour. There is no regulation for high protein flour, but it's generally understood that a wheat flour with anything above 13% protein or above is considered high protein for bread baking. So there's always that difference between what are regulatory standards and what are there's so much information in amongst consumers. There's so much verbiage that is used today amongst consumers that has come out of a lot of these popular specialty diets and things like that, that people don't really realize there isn't anything to create standards to protect them, for lack of a better word, and ensure that they're getting sound, consistent information. So I could say that my cookie has, 5 grams of protein in it. Will give you full 5 grams of protein, even including PDCAS, which is 10% of the RDI. So it's a good source of protein. And I can say, if I say that is high protein, who's to say it isn't? Because there isn't any regulation for things like that. So does that help answer your question?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Follow up on Vicky's question. So for the PDCAS, do you have to use a testing lab to test your product, or can you refer to any literature or FDA data central database to just claim it?
It can be calculated. You can refer to literature and things like that. You do want to go to a lab if you have a novel protein, because it may not be recorded yet or things like that. So then you want to validate that. Or if you feel that there may be synergistic benefits that don't show up in the calculation, then you could send it out for analysis that way, right? But in general, these things have all become acceptable as calculated as long as you're using validated nutrition databases like the FDA and things like that.
So we have one student from our class, Sophia, asked, can you use plant protein powders or whey protein powders in gluten-free baking recipes to make up for the missing gluten?
Yes and no. Yes, you can. Whey is used a lot. I've worked with a company out of Denmark that also has representation in the US called Arla Ingredients, ARLA. And they produce some whey proteins that are specialized. Whatever they've adjusted in it, their functionality, particularly for gluten-free baking. And I've made some breads and some pizzas with their whey protein, and it's very good. However, whether you're using whey protein or plant protein, that alone does not replace the gluten functionality. It's a combination of using these proteins for nutrition and certain functionality, as well as then gums and other hydrocolloids and even instant starches and things like that to get the functional texture, particularly in yeast-raised goods. That's the most complicated. So that the one obvious one is for capturing the gas bubbles. But the other one that we sometimes almost overlook is that some starches that are used in gluten-free baking, like cassava and which is tapioca, they are so complex and so dense that if there is no other sugar available in the dough, that the yeast has nothing to ferment, because it's unable to break down these complex starches into fermentable sugars. So you need to add an enzyme there to help break down those starches. And then the difficulty is finding an enzyme source that is gluten-free, because most commonly in baking industry, barley flour is used, sprouted barley flour. So when you're looking at the sprouted grains, do they provide enzyme activity and are they gluten-free? That could help a situation like that. I found some sorghum syrup from Brice malting that had unintended residual enzyme activity in it. It wasn't something that they intended to do, but that it did have residual enzyme activity in it, and it worked for us. So in producing a gluten-free focaccia. Does that answer your question, Sophia?
She said yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay. And
Another
so
question from Sumita. What caused the particle in the very beginning when you described that after baking, toasting, the particle of beans get into finer? Some thought process be applied to lentil powder. Yeah, we have some researchers and some stakeholders that are working on lentil protein.
yes, that has to do with the grinding process. Wheat flour is unique in the way it's run on corrugated rollers and then goes through different sifting mechanisms to create the type of particle size. A lot of times, things like bean powders, when after spray drying, they're going through something like a hammer mill. So there, the screen on the hammer mill is going to be one of the defining things, but sometimes these hammer mills are so efficient for this type of product that they actually grind it even finer than the screen is, right? And so it depends a lot on that grinding process. We found with some of our bean powders when we were at ADM that they didn't need to be as fine as they were being ground. Because at the time, one of the reasons they were grinding so fine was to be able to increase how quickly it absorbs the water, and so that they could say that you add water to the bean powder and it's fully hydrated in 4 minutes, right? Whereas if you take raw beans, it takes many hours to get them hydrated, right? And so. But it was found that it wasn't necessary, so there was a processing cost savings that took place there to some extent, but also it slightly improved things for us on the processing end as far as when we were making doughs and cookies and things like that. Because when you have a less fine particle, you don't have as much surface area. So a lot of where the initial absorption happens is just that the water is attaching itself to the surface area of the particle, and so this helped us just with batter flows and things like that. Hopefully that answered your question, Sumita.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. That was really insightful. I was also just curious, is the finer particle, can that also be a result of like fisheye formation? Like sometimes when you experience clumping issues that because it's so fine, it can't hydrate itself and it results in some clumping when you add the powder into like a wet mixture?
Yes. So the finer powders will, by also just the residual moisture that they have inherently in themselves, they clump together much easier just in terms of compression. And then when it comes to hydrating, yes, they clump up easier. That is where often if they're being used in a liquid type situation where they're added to, like in making a beverage or something like that, then agglomerating the powder is often preferable, so that it's a form of instantizing it.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yep. Cool, this is great.
Forgot to unmute myself. Mark, I wanted to ask more about fermentation. Fermentation seems to be trendy, especially after COVID. People have more interest in the immune function of food. But fermentation with legumes doesn't seem to go that flavor-wise very appealing. Any insight into whether this is a direction to try working on it? Any inspiration from some ethnic food from places like India or Middle East that they have been eating a lot of legumes? is there any chance that we explore legume fermentation?
Yes, tempeh is becoming very popular, right? And so from some of I haven't worked directly on the tempeh myself, but I provided the fermentation cabinet for a colleague who was, so I got some side hand information a little bit that way. Because I'm always curious, and so but it seems that some of the with proper inoculation up front, that some of the fermentation time can be shortened. And through the different types of yeasts or bacterias that you use, you can do some adjustments to some of the flavor profile to improve that to some extent. It helps to concentrate the protein in these things because it's consuming a lot of the starches and so on. And so that is yes, it's very much part of a very, very popular trend. The fermentation of foods in general has just sort of exploded during the pandemic. I guess people who were bored with sourdough decided to ferment all kinds of things. I have a friend of mine who's a chef in Chicago, and he kept posting these odd things on Facebook all the time. He's fermented so many strange things. And he swears they're delicious, right? So it's really, and it becomes then managing the things that happen with the type of bacteria you're using, so that if you're producing a lot of lactic acid, you're going to end up with a very sour tasting kombucha type thing, right? More vinegary tasting and stuff like that. So you have to sort of adjust some of those as you go along. I don't know how mainstream it will be, but it is growing. And the thing that we've seen about the past 10 years is that a lot of Indian cuisine, and especially, has been growing. The spices was kind of a lot of the first thing, and then a lot of the other regional foods have been kind of rising to the top, and bringing more of those different spices and fermented foods and things like that with it as well. So it's something where things like legumes can fit in with that, because they have similar properties to soy, which is what's typically used for tempeh. And you could do a lentil tempeh or a bean tempeh. I worked with one of our researchers a few years back on lentils, where they did he wasn't really clear on what type of fermentation they did, but they did some type of short fermentation with the lentil, and then they extruded it through a high shear extruder, which partially cooked it. And then they took these dry pellets from the extruder and ground it into a flour. And we were working with that as a wheat flour substitute to try and see if it would fit for gluten-free things and stuff like that. And we got some reasonably good results. It fits in. The other thing with that is not so much fermentation specifically, but if you've heard of aquafaba, which is call it the effluent of the canning process of chickpeas and navy beans primarily. I've tried all of the bean varieties, and so that because a major bean canner is ADM is the sole provider to them, and so I just had to go out and buy all of their beans. And so we tried everything, and navy bean and chickpea are the only ones that really work well. And that the test we simply did was, what was popular at the time was to whip it into a meringue to make foam. And so there is some thinking that this can be done with the extraction of the proteins in other legumes like lentils as well, right? So or pea. So the ones I didn't try any other than the beans and chickpea. And the interesting thing is that it's not just the cooking process; it's something to do with the high retort temperature. Because to simply cook the chickpeas and try to use the leftover water as aquafaba does not work. But yet the liquid from the can, if you ever want to try this, you take the liquid from the can, you take 100 ml of the liquid, and take like 10 grams of sugar and whip it up in a mixer on high speed, it'll take about 10 minutes to whip, but it will whip into a meringue just like egg whites do. So it's quite interesting. That went a little off topic, but I hope that kind of answered where you wanted to go. Yeah.
Yes, very good. Thank you so much. Yeah, I made my student whip the aquafaba in the
Perfect.
classroom using their arm.
So you made them exercise too.
But then they saw that, oh, it's the meringue, it's the egg foam.
There's a university in New Zealand that is doing research on this to scale it up to production quantities. And Dr. Lin and I talked to the gentleman on a Baker In video. So it's somewhere on Bakerpedia. I'll have to try and find it and send you the link. It was quite interesting.
Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question. I was wondering what which products or what processes you were looking forward to, like what's exciting, what's new, what has your attention these days?
Oh, well, I'm one of the things I'm working on right now is I'm working with an inventor company on a novel protein for baked goods, and it's really exciting. It's because it has such an extremely clean flavor to it. And I think plant protein in general is something that we're seeing it continue to grow. There's a lot of opportunity there in baked goods as the other source of protein, so that like I was having this conversation with a lady who is a vegetarian. So things like the Impossible Burger and stuff like that are not targeted at vegetarians. They're targeted at meat eaters, who are, the new phrase today is called flexitarians, people who want to gradually or occasionally change their diet away from meat, right? And where a lot of that comes from is not only an interest in health, but an interest in the health of the planet, in the sense that there is a growing acknowledgement and understanding of how the methane gases from steer and the other gases from the pigs and chickens and so on, how they contribute towards pollution. Now, does that mean we will completely eliminate animal proteins from our diets forever? Likely not, but they will become more scarce, especially as the population grows. And if you consider that it takes 10 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of animal protein, whereas you could just take that 10 pounds of plant protein and feed it to humans, it's more efficient that way, right? Currently, the majority of our plant proteins, such as corn and soy and the clears from wheat production, all go to animal feed. So the majority of our crops really are to feed the animals that we consume. So that is why I believe plant protein has a big future. And that is why companies like Cargill, ADM, and others are investing so much in plant protein and moving that forward. And so as the researchers discover more about fermentation effects and things like I talked about, the complementary amino acid profiles for nutrition, and or through fermentation, how we can augment or change some of these amino acid profiles or these concentrations and so on. There's a shortening that ADM produces through enzymatic interesterification. So if we can use lipase enzymes to change the rearrangement of fatty acids on the glycerol backbone, why can't we do something like that with amino acids on the carboxyl group? So there's things that are happening, exciting things happening in research in that sense. So it's, the thing is, research happens slowly in the background, and then it pops up and everybody thinks it just happened, when it's like that saying, it only takes 5 years to become an overnight success, right? I mean, does that help answer your question? Is there any more to that I missed or should need to get into?
No, that was a good explanation. It was interesting, especially with you'd mentioned that the egg albumin and the gluten digestion, it seems like there's a lot more that we don't know, or a lot more that could be harnessed, especially with plant
Absolutely.
proteins and efficiency of digestion. And so
Mhm.
it's eye-opening.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, yeah. Companies like Cargill and ADM, they have whole teams of researchers, nutritionists, chemists, biologists, and stuff working on these types of challenges.
Well, we're waiting for other people to type questions or think about more questions. Mark, what got you into baking?
Was purely accidental. um, I say that jokingly, but there's some truth to that. My father is German, so I was born in Canada, and my father is German. And in the early '70s, things with the economy and so on led to my father moving the family from Canada to Germany. So I was 12 when I arrived in Germany and did my schooling there. I had difficulty learning the language. It's a pretty tough language to learn. So I finished school at the end of what they call public school, which in those days was the 8th grade. And from there, you go into a traditional apprenticeship. My interest was originally to somehow become an architect. And I looked into trying to do an apprenticeship as a draftsman or as an electrician or something like that that could give me the credit to then go on, because it's university is free, but you have to have the grades or the credits to be able to get in. And there was nothing available. And a friend of mine that I was hanging out with often a lot, he knew April 1st is always when all the apprenticeships started, and he knew I had finished school and didn't have anything yet, and he said, "Hey, you wanna try an apprenticeship where I am as a confectioner?" And what in Germany it's called a Konditor, which is mostly the pastries and the cakes and yeast-raised goods as far as croissants and danishes and things like that, but very little breads. Bread baking is a separate trade in Germany. I learned most of my bread baking in North America through experience, right? So I was 15 years old and I entered into an apprenticeship, and I took to it almost immediately. It was hard at 16, being at work at 6 o'clock in the morning every day. And it was once actually at 15. Once I had turned 16, then I was invited to start at 4 a.m. So, and so it was a small pastry shop. The owner was the chef in the back and making everything with us, with the apprentices. His wife managed the front of the store, which is a separate trade in Germany. It's not something you do as a part-time job. You actually have to learn a trade to be a counter person in a bakery or a pastry shop, because you have to know the products and how they are made and things like that. And so it was sort of it was very much a family atmosphere in that. And so that was 3 years that I did that apprenticeship, and I stayed in contact with my chef and his wife until they both passed away just a couple years ago. And my wife and I had the opportunity to visit with them a few times, and he even had the opportunity to come and visit me in Canada for 3 weeks once. And so it was a very good relationship. And from there, I went on, as I said, into a lot of different places. And I look back on it now and realize that my curiosity was what ended up getting me eventually into where I am today. I was always asking why. There's an expression in German where my chef would always say, "Flörker, you're going to ask me a hole in my stomach," right? And which is to say that you're frustrating me with your questions that I'm going to get an ulcer, right? Because I was always asking why, and not not to make fun of anything, but because I wanted to understand better. I mean, why did we laminate it this way? Why does it rise the way it does? And all these things. And he would always try to help answer those questions, or tell me to ask my instructor at school. Because as part of the apprenticeship, we went to school 1 day a week, and then went and worked 5 days a week in the shop, right? And for that, I was rewarded with $160 a month at the end of the month, right?
Thank you for sharing. That's such a warming, lovely story.
Yeah, I could go on for that. If I just talk about some of the experiences I've had, that could fill an hour easily. It's been quite a journey, and we tend to always, as human nature is, we look back mostly on the fond things, which is a good thing. I mean, I had some difficult challenges at times, but not everything was terrible. I mean, but it was, I discovered, looking back, it was one of these things that it starts to happen as you get older, and I guess as you look back on your life, and also you start to understand more pieces of the puzzle as they come together and things. And I started to realize that my interest in food science and things was born out of my curiosity of truly wanting to understand better how these things functioned. And then the other side of things is that I became a natural mentor over time, perhaps because of the way my chef mentored me, and the colleagues that I got to work with over the years. And so I look back, and there's a lot of people that I helped mentor and give them their opportunities, so to speak, or help guide them to some of their opportunities. And so I like to continue to do some of that a little bit still, as much as I can.
With that, really thank you for spending time with our students, our research group.
My pleasure.
It's right on time at 10:40. So if you still have more questions, feel free to send email to me. I can forward the questions to Mark. Thank you so much, Mark, for this last 1 hour. And sorry again, everyone, for the technical issues that I was trying to fix using 15 minutes. Glad that I was not an engineer. So have a wonderful rest of the snowy day if you are in Montana, and have a wonderful rest of the warm day like Mark right now, 60 degrees something.
Yeah, and I'll add quickly, if you're interested on the baking side of things, feel free to look up bakerpedia.com. And if you'd like to join our baking industry professionals group on Facebook, you'll see lots of different interesting conversations taking place there too. Although we call it baking industry professionals, we don't isolate it to that you have to be in the industry. We just want people to agree to all the rules and tell us what their interest is in the industry. And we have great conversations. And we've helped out one lady, for example, who is she's a homemaker, but she bakes croissants and biscuits for a homeless shelter, and she wants to give them the best possible quality. So we were helping guide her as to how she can prep things the day before so she can bake it fresh in the morning at the homeless shelter and give them fresh croissants and biscuits. And so it's fun to be able to participate in the world of community, of all kinds of things that way as well.
Croissant is the best. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark.
That's good.
Bye-bye.